Hello, and welcome to Lecture 8 of our series for this class. Today, I'd like to turn our attention to the fact that we have two very different kinds of printing block sets or editions. As you can see from the slide, one of them I'm calling imperial, and the other is private. By the imperial, I mean that it was a printing block or a set of printing blocks carved by the government, by the order of the ruler, and that finally the Buddhist monastic community began to carve its own printing blocks. So these monastic sets of blocks that were made, for the moment, I'm calling them private. Look again at our familiar timeline of the Chinese Canon. What we're going to do today is to take one of these lines of development and to talk about them in more detail. If you'll look to the left, you will see the Chongdian, Bilu, Shachi, Jin, etc. That line coming down through the chart is what I want to discuss with you. It is with the Chongdian that you see that these first ever private monastic printing blocks came into existence. So what we are dealing with today is that process. We have already discussed, so this is a little bit of review. We have already discussed the imperial print editions. The imperial print traditions date to the 10th and 11th centuries. And they were a time when the Buddhist tradition was at one of its highest points of support throughout East Asia. And we can understand this when we see that the courts, in one sense, were using Buddhism to legitimate themselves. And that part of this legitimization, or to show how good they were or how powerful, was to create their own set of printing blocks. The first one that we have talked about was done by the Northern Sung. The Northern Sung dynasty, which occupied a large part of what we now know as the nation state of China. They had, as I mentioned before in the lectures, set out to do a task of making things standard. And so even the Buddhist canon came under their surveillance, and they tried to make it standard. On the map that you see, you will note that above the Sung was a kingdom called Liao. And Liao had its boundary with another kingdom, which we today call Korea, the Korean Peninsula, the Goryeo. So we're looking at these imperial block prints first to get a context in which to begin talking. The Goryeo Imperial edition came in two forms, as we mentioned before. From 1011 to 1082, they carved the first set based on what they had received from the Northern Sung. They traced it. They made their own set of blocks, but the content was directly from the Northern Sung blocks. You'll note up above those Jurchen, they were part of, in the Northern Yuan area, these were groups that constantly were harassing Goryeo. And they invaded the Mongols, swept across that area and invaded Goryeo, burned their first set of blocks. And so the Goryeo king, emperor, decided that, of course, they had to have a new one because it represented strength and power, and it also helped to legitimate their rules. So they carved a second set in the 13th century. And that's the one that still exists today, of course. But another very interesting imperial edition was that of the Liao dynasty, often known as the Khitans. In the 11th century, that is 1031 to 1063, this Liao dynasty, which stretched across large areas of the steppes into what we now know as Mongolia and Siberia, these Liao people were constantly comparing themselves to their southern neighbors, the Song. And whatever the Song did, the Liao had to do better. And that included not only warfare, but now they came to have the battle of the printing block editions. Who could believe that nations would line up against each other and have a competition to say, who's got the best printing block edition of the Buddhist canon? The Liao, because of the way they were, said, first of all, we're not carving your Song Dynasty edition. It's really not very good. Your manuscripts are deficient. We're better. And so they looked at their own manuscript tradition. They didn't trace. They made their own. And it was very good. The only problem for us today is, of course, those printing blocks have been destroyed. Even copies of the printing blocks are very limited. Some people now say only 12 scrolls that are assigned to be the copies from those blocks. For years, I tried to see one of those. They're in Beijing. They're a great treasure. You can't just walk in and say, hey, I want to see your Khitan prints. It took me 2 years of work before finally I was taken. And they said, okay, we'll let you see them. We'll let you see one. They didn't say them, one. But I was very excited. I went down to the place where they told me to come, and they put me in this reception room, which was used, I think, for very important visitors because it was a huge room. They put me at one end, and the host for the day was at the other end on a couch, and we were kind of shouting at each other because it was a big room. Finally, an assistant came in, walked over to me, and handed me a scroll. And I was horrified because I didn't have on gloves. They just handed me this most valuable thing, one of the 12 scrolls. And I immediately said, no, I don't want to handle it because I shouldn't. You must give me a pair of gloves. So they broke down and they said, it's all right. It's a copy. I was really, I was so sad that I thought I was going to see the real thing, and here they were bringing me a copy. But they opened it, and I looked at it, although the excitement was not there. So then the man said, I'm going to show you the real scroll that this is copied from. You're not to touch it. We'll just open it a little bit so that you can see it, and we'll put it here next to the copy so you can see what we've done when we made the copy of it. The copy is for putting in a museum display. We're not about to put the original thing in the open display for the public, but we have worked very, very hard to make an identical copy of it. So they opened up the scroll that I couldn't touch, and I was really thrilled because I was actually, then I really felt I was looking at one of the Canon scrolls. It was, to my eye, identical. I was looking at exactly the same passage. And if you had put those two before me, because of I'm not trained, I couldn't have told you which one was the original and which the copy, even to the coloration of the paper. I looked at it and I said, it's so close. How in the world do you do this? There was a pause, and then he said, I'll tell you how we do it. First of all, we have an artist. He paints the paper with tobacco juice, because over time, the paper yellows and darkens, and they can take tobacco juice and make it just the right coloration for the old paper. So first they paint the paper by an artist who's copying exactly the colorations of the old paper. And then they start the process of writing on it after that has dried. And to my utter amazement, what they used to make it was what they assumed to be something comparable to what the first Canon was written with. A wooden stylus, not a brush. And the wooden stylus that they used, which they felt was the closest, was a wooden match. And they had very carefully, with a one-hair brush, copied precisely the short line of one part of the character. And they used an old-fashioned school compass to make that line exactly the same as the original. And then they dip the match end, the blunt end of the match, not the end that bursts into flame, but the other side, the blunt end. They dipped it in and very slowly would move along that one hairbrush line that had been put in the exact copy of what was in the original. And so I was able to see one of the Canon. I'm not sure if I've ever seen it again. Everyone that I've seen has been in an exhibit. And I've always suspected that what I'm looking at are these beautiful, beautiful, precise copies. So anyway, the Canon made their own. We can't really study them quite easily because those blocks have been destroyed. We also, I told you about this, we also have at a place called Fangshan, the Canon or large parts of the Canon carved on stone. And the rubbings from those stones, thousands of stones, have been published. You can see with these beautiful gold spines and to very large copies of it, the beautiful collection of the copies of that. What interests me from the very early work that I did on Fangshan was that I looked for areas where the Fangshan was same place as what we have from the Canon prints, not much, but a few. And the Canon version obviously is closely related to the version that they were using at Fangshan. Many of the same readings that I could only find in Fangshan and on the Canon. Now, of course, the Fangshan was produced long before the Canon block print, but it nevertheless was using the manuscript tradition, which I think was also being used by the Canon people later. Then in the 12th century, everything changed. In the 12th century, we have a whole new set of printing blocks, or I should say, put it in the plural, sets. And that 12th century switch from imperial editions to monastic editions indicates that the Buddhists were very large. They were able to create monastic institutions that had the power and the money and the resources to make 100,000 printing blocks with all the characters, millions of characters carved on them. It was a major, major job to do one of these sets. But the monastic institutions began to step forward, and it gave each of them a great deal of prestige to be able to do this. The Jin kingdom, which covered the Liao region in the 12th century, the Jin people had a nun amongst them. And she, if you could, it's hard to imagine this, but she started a project to make a set of the Buddhist canon on a printing block at her monastery. And she worked at this from 1149 to 1178. When it was finished, she took it and gave it to the ruler of the Jin dynasty. And forever after, it's known as the Jin edition. Jin translates, as most of you know, a character for gold, the golden edition. But it was not an imperial edition. It was private. But it wasn't named after the nun. She is only a kind of shadowy figure in the history of it. But it was given to the royal court, and they were able to claim it as their own. Now, the Jin edition is started, as I've mentioned, and presented in 1178 to the king. Those blocks have disappeared, but sets of rubbings from them have come to light over the years. The most exciting discovery for this was in 1933. They made excavations and repairs to a stupa, a pagoda. And in the upper reaches of that pagoda, they found 4,800 scrolls. And it turns out that those scrolls that they found in that pagoda are rubbings from those plates prepared by that nun and presented to the court in 1178. Amazing, isn't it? So in the 1980s, when the Chinese government in Beijing decided to support a full-fledged edition of the canon, not on printing blocks, but as a print, they chose the Jin edition to be the basis. They chose from those 4,800 scrolls. Now, from those 4,800 scrolls, if we compare them to the Koryo, we can see that they were from the Kaibao edition of Northern Sung. They had been traced. They are identical in formation to what we find in the Koryo, the Korea version as well. Following this, and at the same time, the nun had been inspired probably by the monastic blocks that had begun to be carved in the 12th century in Eastern seaboard of China. The oldest in terms of date is the Chongning edition that was carved from 1108 to 1112. All of these editions that are carved in monasteries have several names. For example, the Chongning edition is also known as the Dongchan because it was done at a monastery in Fuzhou, which is called Dongchan Lingliu. So this was a really important work. It has not been studied as much as you would think it would be. We still need to make sure that we know how the edition was made. It was not a tracing of the Imperial Northern Song edition. It was made from the monastic collection in that monastery. And so with this one, we began to have the fact that there were monastic institutions that had a full set of the Buddhist canon in manuscript form, or at least most of the manuscript, most of the canon. And these were being used another block print was carved and is known to us as the Bilu edition. It too had two carvings like the Koryo. The first carving was 1112 to 1115. But then later on, they recarved, or at least they added substantially to the collection. And the reason for the recarving is that they decided to add to the Buddhist block print editions for the first time the text of the Chan school, the Zen school of Buddhism. The Northern Song had not opened up to these texts because there was some controversy, there was opposition to this school. It was gaining power and would ultimately become the powerhouse of East Asian Buddhism, but these people who were making the block print editions turned their back on it. So in their recarving in 1164, they added the so-called Chan Zen text, as well as the Tendai school, which had also gained in power and had begun to produce material. And their compilations, their redactions were now included in a block print edition. It was a major move. As you can see, it had some names. It was known as Fuzhou sometimes, or the Min. That's because the monastery where it was made was in the Fuzhou province. Almost simultaneously, it's obvious in the 12th century, every big monastery that was worth anything was beginning to say, hey, we too can have a our own set of printing blocks. And so a Shashi edition was made 1126 to 1138. It's known as, of course, as you can see there, it's known by other names as well. And the other names are tied to the fact that it was carved at the Yangji Monastery in the Huzhou province, which is now the Zhejiang province. One of the things about these monastic block prints was not just that they were making a new carving from their own manuscript copies in their big monastery. And it wasn't just that they added materials which were materials that originated in East Asia and were considered to be part of the canon because there were such powerful new schools of Buddhism arising in China itself, and those schools were producing documents. But at the end of the scrolls, this edition put in an explanation for the phonetic issues contained in it. That is, for transliterations. Why did they put a certain phonetic in? And it is a very interesting way to begin to study phonology in China, is to see these phonetic explanations that began to be placed at the end of these major monastic sets of printing blocks. So here you have it again. You can see in the left line coming down the Chongnen, etc. These were definitely crucial, important, descriptive developments in the making of the Chinese Buddhist canon. They were an indication of the power and the dedication which the Buddhist monastics were beginning to put forward in terms of the canon. And the question might be, why so many? Why would you make so many printing blocks? After all, one printing block, you could use it. And for many printing blocks, you could make 100,000 copies before you wore the block down to having to replace it. But I think it shows us that each monastery in China was really independent. They had no centralized governance, so that each of these monasteries had to make their name for themselves. They had to develop their own programs, their own agendas. And so one of the ways in which they could distinguish themselves was to make their own set of printing blocks. So that's just a brief story of the difference between the imperial printing blocks and the local, if we could use that term, the local monastic copies. Thank you very much.